Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Stephanie Craig, and I'm excited to be here to talk more about developing expert learners through this session entitled Teach Them to Fish, Feed Them for Life. Today, we have a couple goals that I hope we're able to accomplish. First of all, I hope that participants will be able to probe a little deeper into their understanding and beliefs of what the 6 characteristics of an expert learner within the context of the UDL framework, what that looks like and what it means. And also leaving with at least 1 to 3 different ideas that you can start tomorrow that give you a beginning or a place to continue to develop those expert learners, regardless of the age of students you work with. Over my experience as an educator, I've worn many hats. I started in the classroom as a teacher. Most of my experience was with 4th, 5th, and 6th for several years. During that time, I also was a homebound teacher, K through 12, and that gave me the opportunity to support students who were at home due to illnesses. I was a Title I teacher working with K through 4 students for a while, about a year. And then I left the classroom and became a UDL facilitator or coach with teachers at 2 different elementaries. This was very valuable for me. It helped me grow immensely in my understanding of the UDL framework, but also help support and be that cheerleader for those teachers that I worked with. Currently, I'm a professor, assistant professor at Marietta College in Marietta, Ohio. And in my current position, I'm working with a range of students who are just out of high school and starting their career in education as a college student. And I have students who are now student teaching and actually have jobs lined up for them. So I'm really excited to have that range of learners that I've had experience with. And so that's the context that I bring to the table whenever I talk about UDL and what you can do with it.
Nobody's born smart. We all start at 0. Can't talk, can't walk, certainly can't do algebra. Adding, reading, riding a bike. Nobody's good at anything at first. There was a time when Einstein couldn't count to 10. And Shakespeare had to learn his ABCs just like the rest of us. Thankfully, we're born to learn. Slowly, surely, you stumble, slip, crawl, fall, and fail, and fall. Frustrating, confusing, trying, struggling, until one day, you walk. 1 foot in front of the other, one idea on top of the next, each wrong answer making your brain a little bit stronger. Failing is just another word for growing, and you keep going. This is learning. Knowing that you'll get it, even if you haven't gotten it yet. Because the most beautiful, complex concepts in the whole universe are built on basic ideas that anyone, anywhere, can understand. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you only have to know one thing. You can learn anything.
Let's do a quick activity. So I want you to think about what is a talent that you feel like you possess? And I'm sure that everyone has more than one, but just pick one for now. And when you decide on which talent to really focus on, I want you to think about these 3 questions and how you would answer them. So first of all, how did you become accomplished at this particular skill? How did you stay focused in order to become accomplished? And finally, is there still room for you to grow or improve with this skill set that you have? If you want to take a moment and pause the session, feel free to do that. And then just hit play to continue with us. If we take just a moment to think back to the activity you completed, really understanding that and getting across the idea that no one was born with an innate talent in any area. It's usually something that's a process. And so you can find the actual definition of expert learners in the CAST book, Universal Design for Learning, Theory and Practice. And within the context of UDL, we focus on learning expertise, the lifelong process of becoming more motivated, knowledgeable, and skillful. And I think this really encapsulates what we want to really focus in with our students if we're going to pull them on board and have them understand the framework and what it means to have these 6 characteristics of an expert learner. Some of you may be very new or newer to the UDL framework. And as you can see here, there are at the bottom, the actual bottom line or the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach when we implement the guidelines and checkpoints of the Universal Design for Learning framework. And so I'm going to blow that up here. And I love that there's a constancy or a consistency with the color coding, the use of the image of the brain for the learning network. So in the first green box, you find the first 2 characteristics of an expert learner that aligns well, not well, but does align with the principle of multiple means of engagement. We want learners who develop those characteristics of being motivated and purposeful. And that doesn't happen by accident. That actually is supported through the implementation of this principle. Secondly, if you look at the purplish square or rectangle, that aligns with the purple principle of multiple means of representation. The 2 characteristics that we're really trying to develop as we use these guidelines and checkpoints is resourcefulness and knowledgeable. And then finally, in the blue rectangle that aligns with the multiple means of action and expression, we want students to build these skills where they can be strategic and goal-oriented. So this is the ultimate goal. And these are the characteristics that we decided we really wanted to hone in on and really choose to take time and get our students to understand what these words mean and what they look like in action. While we shared a more academic textbook type of definition of what an expert learner is within the context of UDL, we also want to take an opportunity to also share not only within our team, but even talking to the kids and sharing with them, what do other people say that an expert learner is? So we have 2 very well-respected people in the field who know how to implement UDL. They're very involved with UDL and with that framework and the implementation. So I wanted to include their take on what an expert learner is.
An expert learner, to me, is really an expert thinker, or an expert doer. So it's a student who does the heavy lifting in a classroom. It's a student who isn't afraid to take a risk, isn't afraid to fail, and gets right back into learning again once that happens.
About an expert learner, the first thing I think of is somebody who's having fun when they're learning. They want to learn. They're happy about being in any setting where they can learn something new. It doesn't necessarily have to be a classroom, but they're able to transfer those skills that we learn in our classrooms to other places in their life. You've got to have good executive functioning and you've got to be able to self-regulate. But that looks really different in different children. Some kids can be expert learners by using their executive functioning supports. Other kids, they don't really need any at that point. So an expert learner looks differently, but those are the 3 key features that I would expect to see. But it's going to present differently depending on who it is.
With the 2 teachers that I mentioned previously, the co-teachers with the multi-age class, they were really excited about this project. We decided we needed a starting point. We needed to know what students actually thought an expert was. So we decided to give them a prompt. This district was 1-to-1 with Chromebooks. So we gave them a couple options where we gave them paper that had lines at the bottom, third of the paper, and then a space at the top that they could then draw a picture. And the prompt that was written at the top just said, what does an expert learner look like? What is an expert learner to you? We allowed students, if they did want to do the paper pencil, if they wanted to have help with the writing, because of the range of ages in this class, an older peer could actually scribe for them, or one of the teachers could sit down and write as they dictated to the teacher. But also they had Chromebooks. And with that being said, the LMS that they used in this district was very robust. With it allowed students to go in and answer questions with audio. It also allowed them to create videos right on the spot. There was nothing that you had to go outside of the LMS to grab tools. It was all embedded within the LMS. So with that, we had all the students one day, we gave them all the choice. We let them choose what they wanted to do. And then we moved forward with what is an expert learner. So what you see here is one example. This is one of the students, and their response to this prompt was, an expert learner is the person who pays attention and he or she does what he or she is supposed to do. Example, the teacher tells you to do a math problem, 864 times 265, and you and a few more people do it. Others talk, draw, or work on the homework. Now, if you notice, and I wish I'd blown it up, but the illustration here has a range of activity going on, but here you see this expert learner with the arrow pointing. They're sitting there and they're in the front and they're doing what they're supposed to do. As well as giving students that option of recording their own answer to the prompt, we also took a random selection of about 10 students that we asked them to just randomly come out in the hall, and we would record on top of however they wanted to respond to that prompt. So here we have a third grader in this multi-age class that is recording what an expert learner is to her.
An expert learner is someone who is a really good student and listens to what the teacher says all the time.
So if you think back to, and I'll just move back a slide. If you look at the response, this response written, and then this response with the video were very, very common. And we got together and we looked at, went over through all of the responses, and it was a bit concerning of the number of students that we saw a common thread coming out in their responses. So first of all, they would list expert learners as always listens and does what the teacher says. An expert learner is smart. An expert learner learns quickly, and an expert learner sits quietly. And through our conversation, as we sort of reviewed and discussed these responses, we really were concerned in that these weren't the characteristics of an expert learner, but more of a compliant learner. And so we wanted to, of course, start at that place where we would have to really address what's the difference between the qualities of a model student and what are the qualities of an expert learner. When we met as a team, we decided that we would start introducing the UDL framework to our students. And we would do this through an initiative that had already started in the district. And that was taking the UDL guidelines from the framework and turning them into I can statements for students. And so these were the school-wide learning outcomes, or SWLOs. And here you see in one classroom, these were chalkboard posters that I had created for my two schools that I worked with. And some teachers would just highlight one of the posters per week or however they wanted to do it. And others just left all of them up in the order that they would have been in on the framework, and then just sort of brought attention to the one that they were currently working on. So looking a little bit closer, this is under multiple means of action and expression for executive function. The I can statement is I can set goals and use feedback to reflect on my goals and direct my own learning. So we wanted to unpack some of the language. So we wanted them to understand that goals are what I'm trying to learn. We also wanted to be true to UDL and use some images that would also help the students with this range of reading ability and so forth to understand and make some connections with the images and the words. Feedback was clarified, something that someone tells me to help me get better. And again, all of the posters students saw them throughout the school. They saw them in every room. And so this was the first place that we started. And we wanted them to get used to the language. And we also wanted them to sort of start understanding that this gives them a little bit more control over their choices and learning. The next step that made sense to us is to actually teach students about brain plasticity. And we had several resources, but we reproduced the original cast images of the different learning networks on just using an overhead, and which I know is old and dates me, but we just use that as a way to reproduce it by hand as a larger poster. We had these around the classroom. The brains really became very salient in the environment. So we would split the groups up. We would do stations, and one teacher would talk about the affective network. Another one talked about the strategic network. And then you can see I'm in the middle, an older picture of me teaching about the recognition network. And we always tried to use which I love this little activity that I learned from Allison Posey, where she would use the palm of her hand as the brain, and we would let them get markers, of course, washable, and put a little purple on the back of their hand once they made that fist to illustrate that was where that learning happened, and they'd pat their head, and so we did lots of activities. But we really wanted to make sure that they understood that our brain can change, and that's how we learn things. And that's how sometimes we forget things, is because we don't practice them. And we can actually learn new habits. It doesn't happen easily, but it can happen. So students loved this part. And we began hearing them say, my brain's getting a few more wrinkles. And, we love to have them talking in that way, because we knew that they were engaged and we knew that they were processing the information that we were sharing. The second step that we decided we wanted to really focus and use a lot of the teaching that we were going to be doing, instruction and projects and so forth, we're all going to be through the context of choice. Because we as a team held this shared belief that having choice is a very key element to UDL, and it's a very key element to being an expert in learning. Learning is knowing what choices to make, and that's not an innate skill that we're born with and we grow up with, that we have to be taught how to make those choices. So we started off with talking about and relating it to the different principles and therefore the different brains and therefore the different colors. So we, anytime we talked about anything that had to do with affective network or anything about engagement, everything was in green. So as you can see here with this slide, it's everything that had to do with engagement, we color coded, and students began to recognize and then could identify what part of the brain are we talking about right now? And they would know, and they could then open the palm of their hand and show it, because in the center of our brain is the affective network. So we wanted students to understand autonomy, what that meant, and how that is independence. And you have to have confidence to have autonomy. You have to have certain skills to have that. We wanted them to understand that there's competence. We wanted to assume competence, not presume incompetence. So this was something that, we did bring in some, and I'll talk about this a little later, but about the growth mindset and how, sometimes we don't think that we can get better, or we don't think we can be good in certain areas. And we wanted to sort of dispel that myth. We also know from research that relatedness, that's what develops. You have this sense of belonging if the choices that you're given have a relevance to you. We wanted to make sure that we were aware that learners at this age, sometimes too many choices is as much a barrier as not having any choice. So, we started off with giving them two choices. You can do this or you can do this. And they loved that. And then we would, of course, they had to understand if you have this choice, this is what you're going to have to do. So if it was a writing choice, of course, we'd have to teach them the expectations of that choice and so on. We also wanted to make sure that we were not assuming that we knew what was relevant. We did a lot of surveys with our students, what do you like? What do you like to do in math? How do you like to show your learning in math? If there's no relevance to a student, we're really not walking the walk and giving them a choice and a voice, because we need to ask students, what's relevant to you? And so a simple thing is just asking is one of those things that we did. We taught them that UDL is self-differentiation. And I know that's a big word for 6 to 9-year-olds, but they understood that it meant, based on discussions we had and different instruction that we provided to them, that meant they could challenge themselves, that they didn't always have to take the simpler task that, and that was something that the teachers learned along the way is, how do we have tasks or have these options or choices that aren't quote unquote too easy for anyone, or how do we steer students away from making those choices? So that was something that we wanted. This is a learning process for everyone involved. And that was what was so wonderful about this. We also wanted students to learn what's the appropriate level of challenge. We have to know as instructors or educators that we need to provide the appropriate amount of supports and resources for students to be successful if we want to challenge them. So these were things that not only we were talking about as adults during planning time, but we were actually having those conversations with the students. We started building a growth mindset library in the classroom. These are just some of the titles, but we would highlight them. We would, sort of talk about different ones, and then students would, want to read it. One thing that I love to use, and we actually did a day's lesson on this, was teaching students that you can feel different on different days, and you'll make different decisions on different days based on that. So in Louis Lord Nelson's book, Design and Deliver, she has a wonderful story about the King's Path. And he brings 3 path makers together, and he says, I want a path created from the castle down to the beautiful river. And so, you guys each come up with a plan, and then I'll choose which I like. And of course, one takes a straight path right from the front door of the castle down directly to the river. Another one sort of makes a meandering, little trail or path through the gardens because, it's beautiful and it's relaxing. And the third creates one that goes up into the mountains, and it's very challenging. And at the end of the story, the king says, I love all these paths because if I'm in a hurry, I can get back to my castle very quickly with this straight path. If I feel like I need exercise and I want to challenge myself physically, I can take the mountainous path. And then if I'm just wanting to enjoy nature, I can take the meandering path. So we wanted them to understand that making the best decision of what tools to use and choices in showing what we know, because those are decisions that expert learners need to make, and that it's not always about it's okay based on how you're feeling or what's going on or what the purpose is of actually taking that path. So we wanted to really talk about the language. We broke down purposeful and motivated learners. We talked about, as in our planning sessions, about growth mindset and building that. The word yet became a huge word in the classroom. We're not there yet. We started teaching students at different phases through this project how to create relevant goals for themselves and how to communicate those, high expectations for everyone. And then how do we support their sustained effort and resilience? But we brought them in on it. It was very exciting to have those learners as part of this planning, and which is odd because that's how it should be. But we wanted to really make sure that students understood and they were on board and they knew that they had a voice in this process. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we put things in place about supporting self-monitoring and regulating emotional reactions. And at this age, there are difficulties at certain times with anger outbursts and so forth. But we really made the effort through this project and in our language, which extended beyond this project, of talking about, okay, we have a cool down area in the room. You're more than welcome to go back and self-regulate. And we were using this language with the students. Then we moved on to choice in representation. And looking at that principle, we wanted to make sure that we had created, the district had created I can statements. And we had many conversations about how much control and choice did students have if teachers weren't allowing them to have access to choices under perception. So it was really up to the teacher with those top 3 access guidelines to make sure that students had available to them the information in multiple ways and through multiple media. We did talk about the variability in the classroom, but we agreed that if we are creating videos, if we are having small group, if we have large instruction, if we are creating different items that supplement what we're teaching as far as handouts and having the different brains, we use the brains a lot, the images of the brains that correspond to the different learning networks on different items, students and color, making sure that color was one of those things that was throughout and helped students to sort of understand and realize, oh, all of the purple things go together. And that has to do with how I'm taking information in. And so we really tried to respect that variability and also teaching them specifically that we don't always want to have things given us, information provided to us in the same way every day. Sometimes we need more than one way, and some days we just need a review of it, and so we could read something quickly, or so we really wanted to make them start feeling comfortable with making those choices, because up to this point, and because of their age, some of them had more limited experience than others, but they hadn't been given a lot of choice in this area. So again, we really honed in on that autonomy and how to be independent as a learner in order to make the best choice for you in the context of what you were learning, and giving them that control and voice. So I had found a resource. Eve Coates had created a very simple yet incredibly interactive and wonderful PowerPoint. I'm not sure why it doesn't say growing your brain. That was the title of the PowerPoint. But in this image of the title slide, it really was about, it really aligned with that starting at zero video. We showed that to students and had them talk about it. And what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Some of them had younger infant or toddler siblings, so they sort of understood. They had a better context in order to put that information. But it was about persistence, and everything's hard at first. Walking's hard, reading's hard, everything is. But if we give up, we never get better. And so that persistence, which is a huge piece for learners to sustain in order to become accomplished and better at doing anything. And then looking at challenges not as more work and, oh, that's so horrible, I just want to do the easy thing and get it over with. But of course, there's that piece of why are they wanting to get over, why are they wanting to get finished with this? Is it not engaging? So that, of course, is a piece that we had to really examine. But making challenges a little bit more fun. So for example, this was a slide at the end where first, what you see on the left, the question was, can you find the green triangle? And of course, they all looked at each other like, of course we can. There's only one thing on the screen. But then the second slide that's shown on the right, that came up next. And then it was, there was a sense of competition in the room with students, and having people come up to the board and try to find it, or having them get with a partner and say, where is it? And then bringing up the slide and having that discussion as a group. Which one was harder? Was it a little more fun, or was it less fun because of it being harder? And so that was something that resource paid off. We had that available for students if they wanted to go back. We also printed out copies of certain slides that we thought were really effective in reinforcing the ideas of what we were trying to get across. So we really did focus on, as I said previously, that on the vocabulary. We want them to be able to understand, what does it mean to be resourceful? And they probably have an idea, of heard, maybe knowledgeable in something means you know a lot about it. But we wanted to sort of allow them to understand that, you only get knowledgeable if you're resourceful. If the only way, and especially in the day and age that we live in now with technology and the easy access to information, is even though we do have the internet available, that we still have to know what resources to trust, which ones are reliable. And so that's a piece of resourcefulness. So we had to explicitly teach students, first of all, you've got to activate your own knowledge. What do I know? A simple question, what do I know about this already? Having them talk to one another. Sometimes it was information that their peers remembered from previous, or maybe a previous teacher had covered a little bit more. But we wanted them to think and sort of give them some explicit steps to go through. What do I know about this? Okay, where does this information, what kind of information is this? And what tools do I know how to use, and that I know is available, that will help me to understand this and remember this? We talked, and this was, again, we really stressed, you have a toolbox, and we actually physically made was on paper, but we created toolboxes and they would draw pictures of all the different images of strategies that they had specifically in order to be resourceful and knowledgeable. And then talking about how, how do we take that information and how do we make it new knowledge for us? And again, we would always go back to a little newer tidbits about the brain and how we have to make connections and how those connections work, and talking about, that connection that happens in the brain. And that really, I think, became very tangible to the students, that they began to understand, but we used the language. At one point, I overheard, and she was a first grader, turned to a neighbor. I was just walking by and I heard her say, "This tool is not working for me. So I'm going to be resourceful and I'm going to go get something else." And it definitely was one of those moments where you smiled and said, yes, they are understanding this. Finally, we approached choice as what most people would automatically go to, matching it to the principle of multiple means of action and expression. Again, it really was the same conversation, just looking at the context in which the choice can be made. So we wanted to respect variability. We wanted to play off the strengths and the preferences of the class. Did a lot of them share the same preferences? Yes. Were there certain students that shared the same strengths? Absolutely. But we also wanted to make sure that we were really thinking about those students on the outside of the range, or at the ends of each end of the range, so that we were really sort of throwing out that net and then creating some really engaging and relevant choices for them to show their learning. Again, the autonomy was a piece that came in, but with this, we wanted to explain how, and actually had a lesson on the different tools that they have and that they've had since they've started school, and tools that they'll learn in the future, and how there's sometimes within certain contexts, there's multiple tools that can be used. But we need to know, and again, going back to that, we need to know ourselves. We need to know our strengths and weaknesses. And so therefore, we'll make the best choices for ourselves and have more control on the output. This particular, there was a few different LMSs that were in place. These online learning learning management systems, LMSs, they were already set up for blended learning. This was already in place. They'd already had been one-to-one for a good year or two. So this was something that was embedded in the environment. The students knew most of the tools that were allowed. What was exciting was this pair of teachers had really decided early on, we're going to really use the robust range of options that are allowed to our students. Now, did we give them did these teachers give them the option from day one? No. As with anything with choices and tools, you have to teach them how to explicitly use each one. So this again really opened up a lot of options for what the teachers could allow the students to use to show how they had interacted and retained the information and processed it. One thing that we wanted to do, we did this up front, and I think I said this before, we did a few different surveys. We asked students, what are your favorite tools? This was actually in a prompt that, again, we allowed them to really reflect on the LMS, the technology, and what's your favorite tool and why when you're showing your learning. And so this was a second grader who was very excited to share what his favorite tool was and why.
My favorite thing to use to complete an assignment is a Chromebook, laptop, or computer. And it's my favorite because whenever you make a mistake, you could fix it instead of paper and erasing. And plus, you could change the words to cursive or black box blue. And yeah, and that is my answer to what is your favorite tool to complete an assignment and why is it your favorite tool? My favorite thing to use to
Okay, so one thing that we did that and on very, again, age appropriate level is we talked to students about passion projects and what were those and, how did this come about? And we sort of talked about the 20% time that Google offered their employees of using this time they gave them to work on whatever they wanted, whatever project they wanted to work on, and trying to get some innovative, creative tools and projects finished and completed that way. So we approached it in the same manner, talking to students and, asking them what are the things that you really like to learn about. Maybe you even know things about a certain topic, but you want to learn more. So this project, when in and of itself, really gave us an opportunity to go through a lot of skills. And so one, walking students through how to choose a topic. A lot of times I had worked with teachers who that's one of their stipulations was you cannot choose anything that you know something about. And we talked as a team and decided, that's not really valuing their preference. It's not really honoring their choice. So, we'd already talked about, if it's easy, you already know it, you're not learning anything. So, it's okay if you want to know more about a certain topic, but let's dive deeper. Let's learn more so you can have more expertise in the content. We went through lessons of teaching a SMART goal, using that acronym to make sure that students learned how to set a goal for themselves that, we talked about. Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it attainable? Is it reachable or relevant? I think depending on which model you use of the SMART goal, and then is it timely? So we went through a lesson teaching that. Students took that and started, ran with it with their passion projects. The KWL was sort of a way for them to self-assess what they knew. And we also took the opportunity then to share, and we could conference with students that maybe were in the same topic area. This was, it wasn't a really, I'd like to call it messy because it really did create an organized chaos in that the teachers were not in front. They were not in control of the class and their every move. They were opening up and trusting the students. And so they could conference with a lot of students at a time or one-on-one about what were maybe some misconceptions that they thought they knew. This opened an opportunity to really touch on digital citizenship. And especially at this age, they would have been teaching this anyway. And this was just a very appropriate place and time to teach that, teaching them the tools and how to research at an appropriate level at where they were being 6 to 9 year olds, and then letting them choose and create the way they would express their learning. We gave them some choices, but we also began to have kids coming up and saying, hey, could I do this? And we open that up. It's just come and talk to us and tell us what you'd like to do. And we'll talk through a plan. And we had a handful of students that did that. So we felt like the Passion Project really encapsulated everything that we wanted to sort of culminate this whole project, Expert Learner Project, in letting them see how, as an expert learner and with these characteristics, how you can learn something on your own, and then you can share it and let other people learn something. Another thing that I had created was actually based on another board game that I had come across, and it's the Expert Learner Reflection Game. And so I just created it. I went through and just where they start, and they would roll a dice, and let's say they rolled a 2, they would go to start and then roll 2. You kept working even when you made mistakes and had failure, move ahead 2 spaces. So we really wanted to bring in all of the pieces that we had been talking about, growth mindset, being resourceful, being knowledgeable, strategic, goal-oriented. We also wanted, and in the aligning with how board games are, there were the few things that, you didn't do this, or you thought this and that wasn't the way, you had a fixed mindset, you lose a turn. So this was something that I had created, but I also created an interactive bulletin board. And in the school, the way that it was designed, teachers would, in this area, in the specific area where I put it, this is where a lot of the specials classes were. And so a lot of times they would be waiting in line, and this gave them an opportunity. They could actively be doing this. So each class had their own marker in a form of some kind of pen, stick pen, and they would come, and there was a place, there was a dice that they could bring, or if they had one on them, and they would roll it, and the class would do it as a whole. So it was sort of a classes playing against classes, but more often it was because my office was very close. I think it was right off here where this young man is standing. I would hear them talking about, we're ahead of so-and-so, but look how far we got this week. So that was fun. And that just reiterated it. It made it a little bit more open to the school, although not everybody was doing the Expert Learner Project. And so it brought in the whole school, and it was an opportunity for all students to look at that and practice those skills. So with the action and expression, with that language of strategic and goal-directed learners, we really did need to explicitly teach, again, how do you plan for your learning? How do you make sure you're prepared and you have all your materials? But even more, in a broader sense of how do I decide what my goal is? And that was very helpful, because they could go back to that SMART goal template and always go back to that and say, okay, where are you? This is the time you gave yourself. Where are you? Always being explicit with, how do you figure out the most effective strategy for you? Giving them multiple strategies, but being very clear that, and the example that comes to me is in math, when I was in the classroom and I would teach double-digit multiplication, and you had different ways that were taught. You had the old algorithm. You could do arrays to actually visually see how to do it. You could do partial products. You could do lattice multiplication. There was different methods that you could teach the students, or strategies that you teach the students, and they would really passionately like one over all the others. And I would say, you need to learn all of them. But once you've exposed yourself to all of them, to choose, you're sort of feeling that attraction to one over another. And it speaks to you. So that's okay to use that one. It down the road may not be the most efficient. And that was another conversation that we'd have to have. And again, another vocabulary word that we would have to talk about. Organization, monitoring their progress, and more importantly is knowing when their plan is not working and when to stop and revise their plan and come up with a new plan. Too many times, and we did go back and forth, the team teachers and myself, about, well, if they get so far in their passion project, they've spent all this time, I don't think we should let them go back and change it. And I said, we got to go back to the goal. The goal is that they're going through this process. That's a process. They're growing and learning through the process. It's not the end product so much. Yes, that's a piece of it, but we really, if they're at a dead end and they recognize, I don't like this, I want to do something different, then we should honor that and we should support it, because that's a skill that, would it have been better if they'd noticed it earlier? Yes, but it's okay to stop and give up on one route, not give up on entirely trying to get to your end destination, but just changing course is okay, and making that normalized in the classroom. And again, going back to what I said before, is really helping them understand their own strengths and weaknesses, and not necessarily judging themselves on what they thought they should be, which a lot of times I think is really stressed in education. And that tends to then have, where you have that fixed mindset of, I'm only as good as my grade. So this, if you look at it, it's just all the executive functioning skills that we really explicitly went through and taught the students during the session. After we got through all of the pieces that we had originally planned to accomplish with this multi-age class, we wanted to go again back, revisit the data that we had gathered, and reassess. So we again handed out the same prompt, gave them the same choices. Many of them chose the same kind of response, or method of response, I should say. And we discovered that what we had done, the things that we had covered, using the language, making the language very salient in the environment, encouraging students to use the language, or asking them to use the language they were learning within context of when they were learning, came back with some really interesting results.
In my opinion, an expert learner is strategic, resourceful, motivated, engaged, and challenged. I think they are strategic because they use strategies to get what they need or want. Expert learners are motivated because they never give up on what they are doing. They are engaged because they listen to the teacher's instructions and what they are supposed to do. As a result of this, most of the time, expert learners get good grades. Expert learners are resourceful because they use resources to find the answers to their questions, and they are challenged because they challenge themselves to make them learn their best. Last but not least, I think expert learners are skillful at learning. I think this because an expert is someone who has a skill or talent at a specific thing, and a learner is someone who is learning about a specific thing. So if you are an expert learner, you are an expert at learning. In other words, you are skillful at it.
As was evident with Casey's video that I just shared, responses were incredibly different in January at the end of this project. We had, prior to actually going through the responses in the fall and September, we had created what's the criteria, what's going to be a foundational answer, what's going to be emerging, what's proficient, and what's advanced. So what are the criteria? And we came up with a list of items that we wanted to have present. And in September, obviously, there were no advanced, no one met the criteria that we had set for having an advanced understanding of an expert learner within the context of UDL. And a lot of the were emerging. Again, there was that theme that went through a lot of the answers of, being a compliant student and so forth. But we saw that totally change in January, where we still had some students who were answering with some indications that they still thought you needed to be compliant, whether they intentionally were writing that with that understanding in their head. They were communicating that through their response. So, but a lot of the answers went up to being more proficient, and we also had more advanced. Another piece of data that was gathered, or that were gathered, if I can get this to move, there we go. As I mentioned earlier on in the session, that we had the school-wide learning outcomes, and that was a piece that had been put in place and initiated earlier in the year. And prior to us beginning the project, the district had all students in elementary actually do a survey where they assessed their proficiency levels at all of the 9 guidelines that, again, were based on I can statements. So as you can see here, the September graph here, we've got regulate learning, stay focused and motivated, and so on, going through all 9 guidelines that were put in the form of a question of where would you put yourself as advanced, or I can't remember the wording of the survey, but it was age appropriate. And then in January, the district again repeated that. So I was able to pull that data from the rest in these 2 classrooms that were combined as a team. And just looking at the color coding here, that there was quite a few in September that were this rust color, that were at the foundational, where they put themselves at a foundational level. But then when you went to January, you could see the jump. This still had some that were assessing them as foundational, but it was so much fewer than those that were saying, I'm emerging on this, or I'm proficient. And even the advancement went up on a lot of these things. So, and again, these were the results both in September and January of these particular students who were in this project. So we felt like we had really hit on something that we wanted to then share, not only with other people in the school, in other elementary schools, but in other areas, especially if other educators around in the UDL world are implementing this, then this is a really effective next step to go toward if you're wanting to move deeper with your implementation. When I have shared this project with different educators, I'm often asked, well, how does this look at higher levels? And not long after I finished the expert learner project with the multi-age class, the first, second, and third grade class, I had a couple teachers who taught 5th grade who reached out, and they wanted to sort of model this or mirror this project with their older kids. So we still went through the same process of deciding, we're going to introduce the framework through the school-wide learning outcomes. We're going to talk about brain plasticity. We're going to talk about, introduce them to the learning networks, using the brains, color coding things, We started off the same with the prompt, and some things that were a little different, but not so much, just would be what would be expected with older learners, is that there was a lot of little checks in throughout that the teachers especially wanted to have. And so using the LMS that they had there, again, it was so robust with the options that students that had available to them in order to express themselves. So in a discussion thread, there were questions and they were allowed to, find an image and also submit that along with whatever their recorded answer or typed answer was. And, this particular student talked about, brains growing. And at first I didn't know that most people didn't know that when they practice and learn new things, their brain changes. Another thing is animals can get their brain growing also. They play with toys, others, and lots more. Last, I didn't know, but I now know babies' neuron cells are not that big, but as the babies grow their bodies and their brain, they get smarter. I hope this image shows how the baby's neuron cells grow bigger and bigger. Thank you for reading my thread. So again, the responses were a little more advanced. And another one that we had, again, this tells you exactly which SWLO they were responding to. What does it mean to self-regulate? So this was something that with the older teachers, they really did want to assess more often and specifically to the different SWOLOs. So again, they had a lot of discussion threads. They would have discussions within the learning management system among the class or groups of students in the class. So this student, not only gave sort of they gave their understanding of what self-regulate means, but they also gave an example when they were in line and this person in line with them started to talk, and they didn't hesitate at all to move because they knew they needed to self-regulate and they didn't want to get in trouble and they didn't want the other person to get in trouble. So we felt, as I spoke to those fifth grade teachers, they felt there was a lot of value in taking the time and doing this. There was a lot of explicit instruction because, again, the executive functioning skills, all those things in the language, they up to this point had not heard a lot. But the fifth graders, I think, really acclimated to using the language a little faster than the younger students, but I don't see that they did it more willingly. I think all the students that I worked with through this project were very, very, I would almost say proud to use the language. They really were proud of themselves when they were able to apply the language and use it appropriately and correctly. Well, it's been a pleasure to be here with you today. I hope that this excites you, and I want to leave you with this quote. The purpose of learning is growth, and our minds, unlike our bodies, can continue growing as we continue to live. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that if you can, more than welcome to reach out if you would like to have any of the resources that I talked about and shared in the session. The chalkboard posters have been updated a little bit. The Expert Learner board game is available. If there's any other resources that I can help you with, or you'd like to share with me, I'd love to have you reach out and contact me. You can reach out to me by email at slc003@marietta.edu. Thank you so much for joining me today, and have a great afternoon or evening or morning.